August 1952. Rogers, Arkansas. A 9-year-old boy named Tommy Whitfield pointed a Daisy Red Ryder BB gun at a tin can sitting on a fence post 40 feet away, pulled the lever, steadied his breathing the way his father had shown him, and squeezed the trigger. The can flew off the post. Tommy ran inside screaming like he'd just won the war. His mother told him to stop running in the house. His father, who worked at the Rogers Daisy factory 3 miles away and had personally assembled that exact gun on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks prior, smiled into his coffee cup and said nothing. That moment, boy, gun, tin can, fence post, played out approximately 11 million times across America between 1950 and 1970. Different boys, different cans, same gun, same Daisy. The company that made it was the largest air gun manufacturer in the world, operating out of a factory in Rogers, Arkansas that smelled like machine oil and metal and something that can only be described as pure American Saturday afternoon. At its peak, Daisy Manufacturing Company employed over 1,000 workers in a town of 12,000 people. They produced more than 3 million BB guns a year. They had a market share so dominant it was almost embarrassing. The brand name had become so synonymous with the product that children who received competitive brands for Christmas said, with complete sincerity, "I got a Daisy," even when they hadn't. Then came the lawsuits. Then came the television. Then came the helicopter parents and the liability attorneys and the big box retailers with their private label knockoffs and their razor-thin margins. Then came the cultural shift so total and so sweeping that the very idea of handing a child a gun, even a gun that fired a tiny metal ball at roughly a third the velocity required to penetrate skin, became controversial. Then the Daisy factory went quiet. How does a company survive 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and 60 years of American manufacturing chaos, only to be undone by the invention of video games and a series of increasingly creative lawsuits involving eyes? The answer starts in 1882 with a windmill company in Plymouth, Michigan, a traveling salesman named Lewis Hofe, and a business decision so catastrophically misdirected that it accidentally created the most beloved children's toy in American history. The Plymouth Iron Windmill Company was founded in 1882 to do exactly what the name suggests, make iron windmills. This was a reasonable business in 1882. Farms needed windmills. Windmills pumped water. Water kept livestock alive. Livestock kept farms profitable. The Midwest was being settled at a rate that made your head spin, and every new farm needed a windmill. Plymouth Iron Windmill had capital, equipment, and a product that served a genuine need. They also had a salesman problem. The windmill market in 1882 was ferociously competitive. Dozens of manufacturers were all chasing the same customers. Getting a farmer to switch brands was nearly impossible. Farmers didn't care about brands. They cared about whether the thing kept spinning when the wind blew. If your windmill spun, they'd buy another one from you. If it didn't, they'd buy from someone else. Plymouth Iron Windmill's salesmen spent months crisscrossing Michigan farm country, demonstrating windmills, arguing about torque and gear ratios, and losing sales to competitors who'd gotten there first. Enter Clarence Hamilton. Hamilton was an inventor who worked for Plymouth Iron Windmill and spent most of his time building things the company hadn't asked him to build. He was the kind of employee that modern corporations would fire and then spend 20 years wishing they hadn't. In 1886, Hamilton walked into the Plymouth Iron Windmill offices carrying a single-shot air rifle he'd assembled in his workshop. It was crude. It was made primarily from sheet metal, which was cheap and easy to work with. It shot a small lid ball using a spring-loaded piston that you cocked by pushing a lever. The entire thing cost about 40 cents to produce. He handed it to the company president, Lewis Cass Hoff. Hoff looked at the rifle. He turned it over. He aimed it at a wall. Then he took it outside and shot a tin can. He came back inside and said, and this is documented in company records, which is remarkable because it's genuinely one of the better lines in American business history, "Boy, that's a Daisy." He meant it as a compliment. The phrase "that's a Daisy" was 1880s slang meaning something was exceptional, first-rate, the best of its kind. And that's how a windmill company named a BB gun. Preparing and narrating stories like these takes a lot of effort and hard work, so if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. Ha immediately saw what Hamilton had created, not just a toy, but a sales tool. Farmers who were skeptical about windmills could be handed a daisy rifle while the salesman set up the windmill demonstration. It was an icebreaker, a conversation starter, a piece of theater. Give a farmer something fun to shoot, and he'd stick around long enough to hear your windmill pitch. The plan worked almost immediately. Farmers who'd been waving salesmen off their land were now inviting them in for demonstrations. Windmill sales increased. More importantly, farmers started asking where they could buy more of the little rifles. They wanted them for their kids wanted them for their friends. Within 2 years, Plymouth Iron Windmill was selling more air rifles than windmills. Within 5 years, they'd renamed themselves the Daisy Manufacturing Company and gotten out of the windmill business entirely. Let that sink in for a moment. A windmill company accidentally invented the dominant American children's toy of the 20th century while trying to sell windmills, and then had the business sense to recognize what they'd created and pivot their entire operation around it. That's either genius or extraordinary luck. In business, it doesn't much matter which. For 50 years, Daisy operated out of Plymouth, Michigan. Michigan made sense. The state was an industrial powerhouse. The proximity to Detroit meant access to metalworking expertise, machine shops, and a workforce that understood precision manufacturing. The railroad connections were excellent. The suppliers were nearby. But by the 1950s, Michigan was also getting expensive. Labor costs were rising. The unions were strong, legitimately strong, in ways that had made workers' lives genuinely better, but that also made manufacturing margins tighter every year. Property values were climbing. The post-war industrial boom had made Michigan factory towns prosperous, and prosperity, it turns out, costs money. Daisy looked south. In 1958, the company moved its entire manufacturing operation to Rogers, Arkansas. Northwest Arkansas in 1958 was not sophisticated. It was rural, it was agricultural, it was the kind of place where people described the nearest city as about an hour off, and the city they meant was Fayetteville, which itself was not exactly a metropolitan hub, but it had things Daisy needed. Land was cheap, labor was available. The workforce was non-union, which meant lower wages and more manufacturing flexibility, a fact that the company's Michigan workers viewed with understandable bitterness and which deserves acknowledgement even in a story that isn't primarily about labor relations. What Rogers, Arkansas also had was a chamber of commerce that practically carried Daisy's equipment off the trucks themselves. The town desperately wanted the jobs. They'd offer tax incentives, they'd build infrastructure, they'd do whatever was needed to attract a major manufacturer to a region that had seen too many young people leave because there wasn't enough work. Daisy arrived in Rogers, and the town changed overnight. The factory went up on Daisy Avenue. They named the street after the company, which tells you something about the relationship, and within 3 years it sprawled across hundreds of thousands of square feet of manufacturing space. By 1965, the Rogers Daisy plant was producing 4 million guns a year. 1,000 workers ran the lines. The Rogers population grew 15% in less than a decade, and most of that growth was directly attributable to Daisy paychecks. In a town of 12,000 people, 1,000 Daisy employees meant that virtually every family in Rogers had a connection to the factory. Your neighbor worked there, your brother-in-law worked there, your Sunday school teacher's husband worked there. The Friday afternoon shift change looked like the whole town was changing clothes simultaneously. The plant itself was a marvel of mid-century American manufacturing. The stamping presses shaped sheet metal with a rhythmic industrial thunder that you could hear from the parking lot. The assembly lines moved with the kind of organized efficiency that Frederick Taylor had dreamed about. Quality control inspectors tested every trigger pull, every cycling mechanism, every sight alignment. At peak production, Daisy could take raw metal and raw wood and turn them into a finished, tested, packaged BB gun in under 4 hours. The products were nearly indestructible. This was both Daisy's greatest achievement and, eventually, its most significant strategic problem, but we'll get to that. The Red Ryder model, introduced in 1940 and named after the Western comic strip hero, became the flagship. The gun had a lever-action cocking mechanism, a wood-grain stock, a Red Ryder logo on the stock, and a compass set into the handle that pointed magnetic north with approximately the accuracy of a man who'd been spinning in circles for 30 seconds. Children loved it unreservedly. Parents loved it because it was a real gun. It functioned mechanically like a genuine lever-action rifle, but operated at velocities low enough that the primary safety concern was wearing eye protection, which most children promptly discarded because safety glasses were for babies and also because they fogged up. This would become relevant later. The 1950s and 1960s were the golden age of Daisy Manufacturing Company, and it's important to understand why, because understanding why things work is the only way to understand why they eventually stop working. Daisy sold BB guns for a very simple reason. America in 1955 believed that boys should learn to shoot. This wasn't controversial. It wasn't political. It was cultural, in the way that deeply embedded cultural beliefs feel less like opinions and more like the laws of physics. Boys received BB guns as gifts. They went outside and shot things. They learned about safety and responsibility, and the relationship between a trigger pull and a consequence. The gift of a first BB gun was a rite of passage so thoroughly baked into American childhood mythology that you could use it as a plot device in a movie and audiences would immediately understand its emotional significance without any explanation. A Christmas Story did exactly this in 1983. Ralphie Parker wants nothing in the world more than a Red Ryder carbine action 200-shot range model air rifle. Every adult in his life tells him he'll shoot his eye out. He receives the gun on Christmas morning and immediately, within the first 5 minutes of using it, nearly shoots his eye out. The movie was set in the 1940s. It was filmed in the 1980s. Audiences of every generation understood it instantly, because the Daisy Red Ryder wasn't just a toy, it was a cultural touchstone with a specific meaning that transcended the object itself. When Daisy sold you a Red Ryder, they weren't selling you a BB gun, they were selling you a cultural inheritance. They were selling the idea that your son was now old enough for responsibility. They were selling the memory of every father who'd handed a son the same gun in the same way for 4 decades. That's a powerful product position. More importantly, it's a nearly unassailable competitive position. You can build a better BB gun. You cannot build a better cultural memory. Daisy understood this, at least intuitively. The company's marketing in the 1950s and 1960s was built entirely around heritage, tradition, and the ritual of the first gun. Their catalogs showed fathers and sons at shooting ranges. Their advertisements ran in field and stream in boys' life. The imagery was Norman Rockwell translated into product photography. Sales figures confirmed the wisdom of this approach. In 1960, Daisy sold roughly 3 million guns. In 1965, 4 million. The Christmas season accounted for 40% of annual sales, which meant that for a few weeks every December, the Rogers factory ran at absolute maximum capacity. Double shifts, every press running, every assembly station staffed. Daisy workers in Rogers could tell you which weeks were Christmas crunch just by the overtime on their paychecks. The economic impact on Rogers was significant in ways that go beyond employment numbers. Daisy workers earned wages that were above the regional average. The company wasn't generous by Detroit standards, but it was competitive for rural Arkansas, and competition in that market wasn't fierce. A Daisy line worker in 1965 could buy a house, support a family, put something away for retirement. The company built a genuine community around itself. There were Daisy softball teams, there were company picnics. There was the kind of institutional loyalty that forms when people work somewhere long enough that the job becomes part of their identity. A Daisy worker in Rogers in 1965 didn't just work at Daisy, they were Daisy people. Their kids went to school with other Daisy kids. Their neighbors were on the same line. Their church pews were filled with the same faces they saw at the shift change. This is the thing about company towns, and Rogers in the 1960s was as close to a company town as you can get without literally being a company town. That economic analyses miss. The factory isn't just the employer, it's the social fabric. When it goes, it doesn't just take the jobs. It takes the community that organized itself around those jobs. But that was still decades away. In 1965, the factory hummed, the presses stamped, the assembly lines moved. The Red Ryders came out the other end in their millions, and nobody worried. Why would they? Daisy had been selling BB guns since before the automobile existed. They'd survived the Depression. They'd survived 2 world wars. They'd survived every competitor who tried to take their market share. The Red Ryder was as American as apple pie and considerably more fun to play with. What could possibly go wrong? The answer, it turns out, was a lot. But the problems came in such different forms, from such different directions, arriving at such different times, that by the time anyone recognized the pattern had become the company's destiny. Problem number 1 was television, not in the way you might think. Television didn't kill Daisy because children stopped going outside. Children in the 1960s and 1970s still went outside constantly. Television killed Daisy slowly, in a much more insidious way, by changing what America thought childhood danger looked like. In 1955, a child getting a bruise was expected. A child getting a scratch was normal. A child occasionally getting hit by a BB was the kind of thing where you checked whether it broke the skin, applied a bandage if necessary, and reminded the child to wear the safety glasses they'd been provided and promptly discarded. Television, and specifically the news coverage that expanded dramatically through the 1960s and 1970s, began showing parents a world in which danger to children was not an acceptable background condition of childhood, but an emergency requiring immediate response. This was partly good. Lead paint was bad. Car seats were genuinely important. A great deal of the post-war American safety movement produced real reductions in real childhood deaths. But the same cultural shift that produced car seats and bike helmets also produced a new framework for evaluating children's products. Not whether they were reasonably safe, but whether they could conceivably produce harm in any scenario that could be imagined by a creative plaintiff's attorney. By this standard, a BB gun was a problem waiting to be classified. Problem number 2 was the lawsuits. Oh, the lawsuits. The legal history of Daisy Manufacturing Company's relationship with the American tort system is a masterpiece of unintended consequences that deserves its own documentary, its own law school case study, and possibly its own support group for the attorneys involved. The central issue was eyes. Daisy guns could, under certain conditions involving ricochets, improper use, or the eternal creative ingenuity of children doing things they'd been specifically told not to do, cause eye injuries. The injuries were rarely severe. They were occasionally severe. They were, in a small number of cases, quite serious. This was not a secret. Daisy had been including safety warnings with their products for decades. The warnings said, in language of escalating emphasis, to wear protective eye gear, to never point the gun at a person, to never fire near hard surfaces where ricochets were possible, to treat the gun as a real firearm, and to have adult supervision. Children read these warnings at roughly the same rate that adults read software licensing agreements. The lawsuits began trickling in during the 1970s and became a flood by the 1980s. The legal theory wasn't always consistent. Sometimes plaintiffs argued the gun was defective. Sometimes they argued the warnings were inadequate. Sometimes they argued that selling a gun capable of causing injury to children was inherently negligent regardless of warnings. Some of these suits were legitimate. Some were, to be diplomatic, creative applications of the legal system to situations where the primary cause of injury was a child doing something that had been explicitly, specifically, repeatedly prohibited in the documentation that came with the product. But here's the thing about lawsuits. Legitimate or not, they cost money to defend, and they affected insurance rates, and they created liability reserves that had to be carried on the balance sheet, and they generated negative press coverage. And that negative press coverage made the cultural conversation around BB guns shift from "that's how boys learn responsibility" to "that's how children get hurt." Daisy's management watched this shift with growing alarm and responded in the way that large manufacturers facing legal pressure typically respond. They added more warnings, modified designs to reduce velocity slightly, and hoped the problem would resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. Problem number 3 arrived in a box under a Christmas tree in 1977 and ran on a television set. The Atari 2600. Here is the thing about video games and BB guns that nobody at Daisy wanted to say out loud, but that everyone in the company understood by 1982. They competed for the same Saturday afternoon. A boy with a Daisy Red Ryder went outside. He set up cans. He shot at things. He had to go outside because the gun only worked outside because you needed space and a backstop and enough distance that the neighbor's cat wasn't in the line of fire. A boy with an Atari 2600 stayed inside. He shot at things on a screen. He didn't need space or a backstop or to worry about the neighbor's cat. He didn't need adult supervision in the same way. He didn't need to carry his gun back home before dark. He just needed to sit on the carpet in front of the television and press a button. Both activities involved a boy and a simulated or semi-simulated shooting experience. One of them required going outside. In the late 1970s and through the 1980s, requiring children to go outside went from being a feature to being a bug. Daisy's sales held through the early 1980s, carried by the enormous cultural momentum of 40 years of Red Ryder mythology. But the trend line was starting to bend. The Christmas crunch weeks were still the Christmas crunch weeks, but the numbers were softer. The catalog orders weren't growing the way they'd grown through the 1960s. The Daisy executives looked at the data and reached for explanations that felt more comfortable than the truth. The economy was sluggish in the early 1980s. Parents were spending less on gifts generally. The housing market was doing this or that. Competition from low-cost imports was affecting margins. All of these things were true. None of them were the main problem. The main problem was cultural. The main problem was that the specific slice of American childhood that Daisy had served, the outdoor, independent, go outside and don't come back until dark version of childhood, was quietly, gradually, then suddenly becoming historical. This happened for reasons that are individually reasonable and collectively devastating. Parents had fewer children, which made each child feel more precious and more worth protecting. Neighborhoods became more suburban and more spread out, which made unsupervised outdoor play feel less safe. Television news made distant dangers feel local and immediate, which made parents more cautious. And then video games arrived and made staying inside genuinely actively fun in a way it had never been before. No single one of these factors would have been fatal to Daisy. All of them together were a different matter. Here is a fact about Daisy that is both admirable and, in retrospect, a little heartbreaking. They kept making excellent BB guns. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Daisy continued to invest in product quality. The engineering was solid. The manufacturing was precise. The Red Ryder remained mechanically excellent, the same reliable, accurate, properly weighted lever action that Tommy Whitfield had fired at that tin can in 1952. The problem was that Daisy's response to declining sales was, primarily, to make better BB guns. This is not, on its face, an unreasonable response. If your product is declining in sales, improving the product seems like a logical approach. The issue is that the product wasn't declining because it was bad. It was declining because the culture that created demand for it was changing. And you cannot solve a cultural problem with an engineering solution. Daisy tried several things. They expanded their product line into higher-powered air rifles for adult target shooters and hunters. This was strategically sensible. Adults with disposable income and genuine interest in airgun sport could support a premium product line with premium margins. The problem was that Daisy's brand identity was so thoroughly associated with children's first guns that moving up market felt wrong to consumers in both directions. Adult serious shooters didn't want a Daisy, and parents who associated Daisy with training guns for children were confused by high-powered products aimed at adults. They tried marketing campaigns that leaned harder into the heritage and tradition angle. The Red Ryder's connection to A Christmas Story, which had become a perennial holiday television broadcast by the mid-1980s, was valuable. Daisy leaned on it heavily, and it helped. Christmas Story merchandise and tie-ins gave the brand a cultural relevance that pure product marketing couldn't have purchased. But nostalgia is a complicated foundation for a business. It brings in the parents who remember their own first gun. It doesn't necessarily bring in the children who've never been outside long enough to develop a relationship with the concept. The Rogers factory kept running. It ran leaner than it had in the 1960s. The overtime weeks were fewer. The double shifts were rarer. Employment declined gradually, then less gradually. From a peak of around 1,000 workers, the factory workforce fell to 700, then 500, then lower. Each reduction was announced as a productivity improvement, a realignment, and optimization. The language of corporate restructuring has a remarkable ability to make contraction sound like progress. The workers who remained were good at their jobs. The machines were well maintained. The Red Ryders coming off the line in 1990 were, mechanically speaking, better than the Red Ryders coming off the line in 1960. They just weren't selling as well. In 1987, a plaintiff's attorney in Ohio filed a lawsuit against Daisy that would have seemed familiar in its basic structure: child, BB gun, eye injury, but was different in one critical respect. The legal team had done their homework, and they'd done it thoroughly. The suit argued not that Daisy's gun was defective in the traditional manufacturing sense, but that the gun was designed in a way that made it foreseeably dangerous to its primary market, which was children who were foreseeably unable to use it with appropriate caution, which made the design itself the defect. This is called a design defect theory, and it's one of the more interesting developments in product liability law because it means you can build a product correctly according to your own specifications and still be liable if those specifications produce foreseeable harm. Daisy settled the Ohio case. They settled most cases because going to trial on an eye injury involving a child is the kind of thing that makes juries feel things, and juries feeling things is expensive. The settlements were confidential, which meant each new case had to be treated as if the previous ones hadn't happened, which is its own kind of legal theater. By the early 1990s, Daisy had a legal department that was, proportionally speaking, enormous for a company of its size. The insurance premiums were significant. The liability reserves were significant. Every year, a meaningful percentage of the company's revenue went to managing the legal consequences of making a product that worked exactly as designed and was occasionally misused in ways that caused injury. The company modified the guns. They added more prominent warning labels. They reduced muzzle velocities. They introduced safety mechanisms. Each modification was genuine. Each one reflected a real attempt to make the product safer. And each modification also became, in subsequent lawsuits, evidence that previous designs had been insufficiently safe, because why else would you change them? This is the peculiar torture of product liability law in the consumer goods space. Every safety improvement you make is simultaneously an admission that the previous product needed improving. There is no good move. There is only less bad. Daisy's leadership understood this and kept making improvements anyway because the alternative, stopping improvements in order to avoid creating an implicit admission of previous inadequacy, is both legally and morally indefensible. But the costs kept climbing, and the sales kept declining. And the gap between the two, which had once been wide and comfortable, was narrowing in a direction that made the accounting people nervous. In 1988, a company headquartered 20 miles south of Rogers, Arkansas, in Bentonville, was in the process of becoming the largest retailer in the United States. Wal-Mart's relationship with Daisy is a case study in the difference between a big customer and a good customer. Wal-Mart was Daisy's biggest single retail customer through the late 1980s and 1990s. The volume was significant. Having Wal-Mart distribute your product meant access to a retail footprint that no other single chain could match. For a company whose sales were declining in traditional sporting goods and toy stores, Wal-Mart represented a crucial lifeline. It also represented a negotiating counterparty with leverage that Daisy couldn't match. Wal-Mart's business model in this period was built on everyday low prices, which meant continuous pressure on supplier margins. Every year, the conversation with major suppliers went something like this: here's what we paid last year, here's what we'd like to pay this year, figure out how to make it work. Preparing and narrating stories like these takes a lot of effort and hard work, so if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. For some suppliers, this was manageable. If you had genuine economies of scale, if your manufacturing was world-class, if you had pricing power with your own suppliers, you could absorb the annual margin squeeze. Daisy didn't have much room. The Rogers factory was efficient but aging. The product hadn't changed fundamentally enough to dramatically reduce manufacturing costs. The liability insurance was a fixed cost that didn't respond to retail price pressure. The workforce had been reduced about as far as it could be reduced while maintaining quality. And now Wal-Mart was introducing private label and cheaper imported alternatives alongside the Daisy product. A customer walking down the sporting goods aisle at Wal-Mart in 1995 would see the Daisy Red Ryder at one price point and a Crosman or a Chinese-manufactured alternative at 25% less. Some customers bought the Daisy. Many bought the alternative. The Red Ryder's brand equity was real, but not infinite, and 25% is a meaningful price difference when you're a parent buying a birthday present. Daisy's response was to try to lower their retail price, which required lowering their production cost, which required either cutting quality or cutting workers. They were genuinely reluctant to cut quality. The Red Ryder's mechanical excellence was the company's most legitimate point of pride, so they cut workers. The Rogers factory workforce declined further. The community that had organized itself around Daisy paychecks for 40 years felt each reduction. The softball teams stopped playing. The company picnics got smaller, then stopped. The social fabric that manufacturing jobs create when they concentrate in one place frays at exactly the rate that those jobs disappear. If you want to understand what happened to Daisy in the 1990s, you have to understand what was happening to American childhood simultaneously, and you have to understand that Daisy's leadership was looking at the problem from inside the problem, which is the worst possible vantage point. The cultural shift that was killing Daisy wasn't malicious. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was the compound interest of a dozen independent changes that were each individually defensible or even positive. Liability law evolved to better protect injured consumers. Good. Parents became more cautious about unsupervised outdoor play. Understandable. Video games became genuinely entertaining alternatives to outdoor activities. True. Schools implemented policies against toy weapons of any kind. Arguable, but real. Media coverage of gun violence increased and created associations between guns and harm that bled into the children's toy category even when the guns in question were spring-loaded projectile devices that couldn't penetrate cardboard. Complicated and real. Each of these changes in isolation is arguable. Together, they created a cultural environment in which the Daisy Red Ryder went from being an essential childhood rite of passage to being a product that required, depending on who you were talking to, either a conversation about gun safety, a conversation about appropriate childhood activities, or, in certain school districts, a formal explanation of why your child was in possession of what technically met the definition of a weapon. Daisy tried to navigate this by doubling down on the one thing that still worked. A Christmas Story. The movie had become, by the mid-1990s, a legitimate cultural phenomenon. It played continuously on cable television over the Christmas holiday in a rotation so relentless that American families could practically quote it from memory. Ralphie's desperate desire for a Red Ryder carbine action 200-shot range model air rifle had become one of the most recognizable Christmas movie plots in American cinema. Daisy licensed the imagery. They produced official A Christmas Story Red Ryders with leg lamp graphics on the stock. They created gift sets themed around the movie. They leaned into the nostalgia with everything they had. It worked, partially. The Christmas Story tie-ins sold. The nostalgia was real. Parents who'd loved the movie wanted to give their children the same experience, or at least the same prop. But nostalgia-driven purchasing is inherently limited. You can sell a person a Red Ryder once because it reminds them of something. You can't build a growing company on once. In 2000, Daisy Manufacturing Company moved its headquarters from Rogers, Arkansas to Warrensville Heights, Ohio. The factory stayed in Rogers. The corporate offices moved. This is a small detail that contains a large truth. When a company's leadership decides it no longer needs to be physically present where its product is made, the relationship between the company and the place that made it has changed in a fundamental way. The Rogers workforce understood this, even if no announcement said it directly. You can read a great deal into where the bosses choose to sit. The Ohio relocation was presented as a strategic move, better access to major markets, proximity to investors, the usual language of corporate geography. And those things were true, but it was also a signal, intended or not, that Daisy no longer thought of itself primarily as a Rogers, Arkansas manufacturer. It thought of itself as a consumer products company that happened to manufacture in Rogers, Arkansas. The distinction seems subtle. It isn't. A company that sees itself as a manufacturer builds its identity around making things. The factory is central. The workers are essential. The product's physical excellence is a source of genuine pride because the people making it are proud of what they make. A company that sees itself as a consumer products company builds its identity around selling things. The factory is a cost center. The workers are a line item. The product's physical excellence matters only insofar as it supports the price point and the brand position. Daisy by 2000 was increasingly the second type of company, not by choice but by drift. The pressures on margin had made every part of the operation a cost to be managed rather than a craft to be sustained. The Rogers workers felt this. The culture shifted. The place was still doing the same things, stamping metal, assembling mechanisms, testing trigger pulls, but the feeling of doing work that mattered had been replaced by the feeling of doing work that was constantly being evaluated for how much it cost. The factory's last years in Rogers were not a sudden collapse. They were an erosion, which is in some ways worse. Erosion is hard to fight because it looks day to day like normal operations. The presses still run. The assembly lines still move. The Red Ryders still come out the other end. But the volume is lower. The shifts are shorter. The maintenance budget is tighter. The equipment that breaks gets fixed when it absolutely must and deferred when it possibly can. By the early 2000s, the Rogers Daisy factory employed roughly 300 people. That's down from 1,000 at the peak, but 300 is still 300 families, 300 mortgage payments, 300 reasons to keep the lights on. The community had already adapted to the smaller Daisy. Rogers had grown in the intervening decades. Wal-Mart's headquarters in nearby Bentonville had turned Northwest Arkansas into a genuine regional economy, and the growth of the Wal-Mart supply chain had brought jobs and development that partially filled the gap left by Daisy's contraction. But Daisy wasn't done contracting. In 2007, the company announced it was closing the Rogers manufacturing facility entirely. Production would move to a contract manufacturer, eventually offshore. The brand would continue. The Red Ryder would continue. The Christmas Story tie-ins would continue. The Rogers factory would not continue. The announcement came with the usual language: business conditions, competitive pressures, operational efficiency. The words were accurate as far as they went. They just didn't go very far. For the workers who remained, the news was devastating in the specific way that job losses are devastating in communities where the job was also the community. It wasn't just the paycheck, it was the identity, the daily structure, the people you saw every morning, the thing you were part of. 200 and some workers received notices. Some found other work in Northwest Arkansas's growing economy. Some didn't. Some were old enough to retire and did so with mixed feelings about how the ending had arrived. Some were young enough to start over and had to figure out what starting over looked like. The machines were sold. The equipment was auctioned. The building sat. On Daisy Avenue in Rogers, Arkansas, there is a Daisy Airgun Museum. It's a good museum. It's genuinely worth visiting. It contains a comprehensive collection of Daisy products from 1886 to the present, organized chronologically in a way that lets you trace the evolution from Hamilton's first crude sheet metal rifle through the Red Ryder's many iterations through the modern product line. There are photographs of the factory at its various stages. There are records of the Christmas crunches. There are examples of the original marketing materials, the Norman Rockwell-adjacent imagery of fathers and sons and tin cans and fence posts. The museum is maintained with obvious care and genuine love for what it represents. What it represents is a century and a quarter of American manufacturing history that began with a windmill company and a happy accident and ended with a brand licensing arrangement and a contract manufacturer somewhere that isn't Rogers, Arkansas. The museum doesn't put it quite that way. A few miles from the museum, there's a stretch of Daisy Avenue where the factory used to be. The building is still there, repurposed, as American industrial buildings often are, into a mixed-use facility that houses various small businesses and storage operations. If you walk the perimeter, you can still see the loading dock infrastructure. You can see where the rail siding used to connect. You can see in the architecture the logic of a building that was designed for manufacturing. The ceiling heights, the floor layouts, the way the light comes through the high windows, being used for something else entirely. The building doesn't know it used to make things. Buildings don't know things, but the people in Rogers who are old enough to remember do know, and they'll tell you about it if you ask. They'll tell you about the overtime weeks before Christmas. They'll tell you about the smell of machine oil. They'll tell you about the shift changes and the parking lot filling and emptying on a rhythm that the whole town knew. They'll tell you about the day they heard the factory was closing and how the news moved through the community faster than any official announcement, because in a company town you don't need an official announcement. You just need one person to tell two people who each tell two people, and within an afternoon everybody knows. Here is the thing about Daisy that is simultaneously comforting and unsatisfying. The brand survived. The Red Ryder is still sold. You can buy one right now at Wal-Mart or Amazon or a sporting goods store. It looks essentially the same as it did in 1940. The lever action cocks the mechanism. The trigger releases the spring. The BB travels downrange at a velocity that will sting but rarely injure when used correctly. The A Christmas Story tie-in products still sell every Christmas season. Ralphie still wants his Red Ryder. TBS still runs the movie continuously from December 23rd until the early hours of December 26th, because apparently America has collectively decided sleep is optional during the holidays. The company that now owns the Daisy brand is a holding company. The guns are manufactured by contract manufacturers. The brand is managed by people who interact with the Red Ryder as a brand asset rather than as a manufactured object with a history and a place and 1,000 workers behind it. This is not a criticism. It's just a description of how brands outlive the companies that created them and the communities that made them real. Baby Ruth is still sold, made by Ferrero now, in a facility that employs a fraction of what Otto Schneering's Cicero Avenue plant employed. The bar tastes similar. The factory is storage units. General Motors employs 5,000 people in Flint. Flint's population is less than half its peak. Mack Trucks still puts a bulldog on the hood. 800 people make those trucks in Macungie, Pennsylvania. The Allentown plant is a parking lot with weeds pushing through the asphalt. The brands survive. The communities that built the brands do not survive in the same way. Rogers, Arkansas is fine, actually. The Wal-Mart supply chain economy that grew up around Bentonville saved Northwest Arkansas from the fate that befell Flint. There are jobs, growth, new restaurants, new housing. The University of Arkansas draws enough people to keep the region economically viable. Rogers didn't die when Daisy left. But the specific kind of community that a factory creates, the sense of making something real, of participating in a production process with a visible output you can trace back to your own hands, that's gone. It's gone because the factory is gone. The 4 lessons the Daisy story teaches are real, and they're also, ultimately, unsatisfying. The first, you cannot engineer your way out of a cultural problem. Daisy's engineers kept making excellent BB guns while the market for excellent BB guns quietly contracted. The excellence was real. The market contraction was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, and one did not affect the other. The second, liability drains the resources needed for reinvention. The lawsuit decades didn't kill Daisy directly. They bled the company of money that might have gone toward adaptation, toward finding new footing in a changing market. Death by 1,000 legal settlements is still death. The third, a highly specific brand identity is both an asset and a trap. Daisy owned one category. First gun for boys, completely and absolutely. When that category declined, they didn't own anything else. The brand said one thing too clearly to say anything new. The fourth, when the decision makers move away from the factory becomes a line item. The Rogers workers understood this when headquarters moved to Ohio in 2000. Decisions feel different when you live near what they affect. They knew it too late to change it, and not quite late enough to be surprised. Stand in the Daisy Airgun Museum on a quiet Tuesday in autumn, and the volunteer, probably a retired factory worker whose family connection goes back 40 years, will tell you the Red Ryder is still being made, which is true. What they won't say is that the making and the brand have been separated, and the separation matters. The brand floats free. The making happens somewhere else, by someone else, optimized for cost rather than continuity. Rationality and loss are not mutually exclusive. You can understand exactly why something happened and still feel the absence of what it replaced. The factory is gone. The 1,000 workers are gone. The Christmas crunch overtime is gone. The town adapted and survived, which is the best available outcome when the alternative is neither adapting nor surviving. The Red Ryder remains. The smell of machine oil on Daisy Avenue is gone. On cold mornings in northwest Arkansas, the air smells like pine and earth and Ozark autumn and nothing else. The tin cans, somewhere, are still waiting. The Daisy Airgun Museum is open Tuesday through Saturday in Rogers, Arkansas. Admission is free. A Christmas Story plays every December continuously until someone turns it off. Nobody turns it off. Preparing and narrating stories like these takes a lot of effort and hard work, so if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing.